Every single week, we prepare these moments for you because we believe that God has something pretty awesome for us on this journey of grace and mercy and love. And I'm glad that you took time out of your week to be here. It's good to see you all. And this weekend is part 2 of this series. God never said that. If you missed last weekend, we talked about one of the misconceptions that people have about God. We talked about this phrase, God wants you to be happy. And last week we asked a pretty tough question. Are there times that God doesn't want you to be happy? Because God really did not say that we will or should always be happy, or that his desire for us is to always be happy. He's our dad, and those of you that have children know that your highest priority for your child is not that they're happy. It's something else. Happiness is just a byproduct of the other great things that you have in store for them. And so if you want to check it out, you can go to our website. We put all our messages on our website, and you can go and take about 24 minutes out of your week and listen to it. I think it was a pretty good one. Now, to set up what we're going to talk about today, let me start this way. I used to sit under the mentorship of a gentleman, and he used to say something that bothered me quite a bit. He used to say this: either you're going through a pretty tough time right now, or you are coming out of a pretty tough time right now, or you are just about to go into a pretty tough time. And I didn't like it, for the same reason that anybody would. Nobody likes going through hard times. Nobody likes going through seasons of their life where they feel like everything is out of their control and they can't take it anymore. But the thing with life is that you will always walk through situations that are harder than you can handle. There will always be stresses. There will always be times when you're emotionally or physically overwhelmed. There will be times when there are so many demands on you that you feel like you're going to be ripped apart. Some of us in this room are in what is called the sandwich generation. You have, your parents, your aging family members on one hand, making demands of you, and then you have your children on the other hand. And you feel like the demands from your children and your aging parents or aging family members are pulling you apart because you're trying to manage the needs and the wants of both of them. That's the way life is. There are stages of life. There are medical concerns. There's death. People die. Relationship challenges. There's work stresses. There's loneliness. There's anxiety, on and on. And some of us are at the point, and I felt like this last week, some of us are at the point where if one more thing comes along, you will just lose it. And you know what drives me nuts? In those really tough moments, some well-meaning person will step into my life and will say, whenever God closes a door, he opens a window. What the heck? What does that even mean? If I'm on the 25th floor of a burning building, that's terrible advice. What, I jump out the window? Come on now. But another thing that you will always hear people say as a way to comfort you when you're going through tough times is, God will never give you more than you can handle. And this is what I'd like to talk about today. Because, surprise, surprise, God never said that. It's not in the Bible. It is not a promise that was ever given to anybody. And I heard this phrase so many times as a Christian when I was coming up that I decided to go through the Bible, because I'm a nerd like that, to see if I could find out where it had been said. And the closest thing that I got to anything like that was actually, when you read it, it says something remarkably different. I think Paul, who wrote the letter that this scripture comes from, was saying something different. You have it on that sheet. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. This is what Paul wrote. He said, no temptation has ever overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. This is where your sheet will read. It says, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. The passage does not say God will not give you more than you can handle. It says God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. There's a huge difference between these two statements. One is a platitude. God will not let you go through more than you can handle. That's a platitude. It's designed to make you feel like you can work yourself out of a tough situation. But this one in Scripture is a promise from God about strength in the face of temptation. And the Bible provides us with a very clear picture of the way God works. In fact, God allows us to go through situations that are more than we can handle. In the Bible, there's so many people that went through things that were much more than they could handle. Much more. In about 400 BC, there was a young woman called Esther. There's a whole book in the Bible dedicated to her. Esther was nothing more than an ornamental beauty queen in the Persian emperor's palace. Now, this young woman, who used to be a slave with no political influence, with God's help, she was able to save her people from a genocide. Now, make no mistake about it. In the process of trying to save her people from genocide, she was in over her head. Saving her people was much, much more than she could handle. Gideon is another person that's mentioned in the Bible. I don't know if you know his story. But Gideon was this guy. He was like the last of the last of the least of the least. And in fact, when an angel approached him and said, God has called you to deliver his people, the angel approached him and addressed him as mighty deliverer. Gideon was like, I don't think you're speaking to the right person. Moses, who led the Israelites out of Israel, when God first came to him in a burning bush and said, you're the one who's going to set my people free, Moses was like, no, I don't speak right. I stammer. I can't string a sentence together. I have anxiety and guilt from my past. He didn't think he would be able to deliver the Israelites out of slavery. It was a situation that was much more than he could handle. David. What shall we say about David? In a moment of real emotional and physical turmoil, there was a situation he was going through. And the Bible doesn't really tell us what it was. But it seems like it was so much more than he could handle. And so he wrote a song. It's a very painful song. He said, my guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. My wounds fester and are loathsome because of my sinful folly. I'm bowed down and brought very low. All day I go about mourning. My back is filled with searing pain. There's no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. This is a song of someone who's going through something pretty tough. Or in Mark's gospel, Jesus, on his way to the cross, he seems just overwhelmed by the enormity of what he is about to face. Mark 14, it says, then they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. Now he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to feel deeply distressed and troubled. And he said this, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible from you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but you will. And if you read that story, Jesus sweated drops of blood because the task that was ahead of him was so huge. He knew what he was about to get into. So it would seem like this phrase that we throw around about God not giving you more than what you can handle is actually wrong. God never said that. It's not a pattern in the Bible. As a matter of fact, God I can assure you, will actually let you pass through situations that are more than you can handle. So we have to ask the question, why would God let you go through more than you can handle? Why? I think God allows us to go through more than we can handle to learn to depend on Him. You see, when things are going great in your life, things are going fine, even as people who've been Christians for a long time, there's a tendency for us to forget God, isn't it? It's true. When things are going fine, we live our lives with no room for God. We just go about our lives like God doesn't exist and He's not really concerned with what's going on. Now, what happens when things suddenly get rocky? When you hit rough waters, all of a sudden, that's when you remember that God exists. When we're hurtling to something that we can't control, we have no control over it, that's when we cry out, God, help me, help me. Even people who do not acknowledge the existence of God, when they're going through a tough time, they will suddenly cry out. And I think that this is why God lets us face these situations. Because we needed to be reminded from time to time that we do not have all we need. We're not designed that way. Now, make no mistake about it. Inside of each one of us, God has placed an incredible amount of intelligence and resourcefulness. But even with our peak intelligence and our peak resourcefulness, we still don't have everything that we need to face all that life has to offer. And as a result, we need to depend on God and depend on His presence. You see, the problem with thinking that God will not give you more than you can handle is that when you actually find yourself in situations that are much more than you can handle, it is so easy in those moments to start to doubt God. Where is God? Why would He let me go through this? But here's the thing, God's presence never left. God's presence is with you even in the times that are too tough to handle. So never let the presence of a storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. Never let the presence of a storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. Because when you learn to depend on His presence, you know that you can call on Him and that He'll be there for you. We read earlier in Psalm 38, the song that David writes when he's sick and depressed and he's going through something really trying. But it seems like later on in his life, David figured this out, this very same thing that we're talking about. And he wrote in Psalm 145, verse 18, he said, "The Lord is near to those who call on Him, all who call on Him in truth." I think that he realized that in his tough times, if he leaned on God and he searched for God's presence, he would find that God was near. 14 years ago, 14 years ago, it just hit me. I've been in Canada for 14 years. And I moved here with unrealistic dreams about what my life would be. Before I moved here, I thought that my life would be on a trajectory for incredible financial and personal success. I mean, that's what they told us before we got here. But every immigrant who gets sold on an idea of Canada gets here, and in a few months after you arrive, your dreams are completely crushed. And after you've spent all your savings, it feels like you're left with nothing. Now, I was a Christ follower at the time, but I had never had to call on God like my first year here in Canada. And what started to happen is that as I called on God, as I was going through that really difficult time of adjusting to life here in Ottawa, God brought an incredible support structure into my life that helped me to grow and become a more compassionate person. God helped me to change from being a person that my wife hated to being a person that she wanted to marry. In the deepest, darkest parts of my life, I had to learn to depend on God. And those were the moments where I grew the most. Those were the moments where God did His best work in my life. Now, I'm not going to lie. It sucked going through that. It really did. And yet, looking back, I realized that learning to depend on God and leaning on him and on his presence, he did a work in me that would have not happened had I not gone through that season. And so I found something that I can say with confidence. It's a bit shocking when I say it to people that do not believe as I do. But this is it. I would rather be hurting in the valley of my life with God than be on the mountain of my life with all the best things, but without God. I would rather be in the toughest times of my life experiencing God than in the best times of my life completely devoid of him. God allows us to go through more than we can handle so that we can learn to depend on him. But he also allows us to go through more than we can handle so that we can experience his power. So that we can experience his power. As I said earlier, we've all been created with this really incredible intelligence and resourcefulness. In fact, inside of each one of us, I guarantee you, there's a deep reservoir of strength, which is why, as humans, we can go through some pretty tough times without bending or breaking. But here's the thing, life will always throw you something that will bend you and will break you. It is outside your intelligence, it is outside your resourcefulness, it is outside your will, it is outside your strength. Some of us who have kids, we know how difficult it is to watch your kid go through sickness and disease. There is nothing more heartbreaking. There's nothing that makes you feel more powerless than watching your child go through something that you cannot fix. Some of us have lived through war and famine. But we don't even have to go to the wars and those things. We don't even have to go through those things. Let's try something simple. Those of you who are parents who have older kids, have you ever been a parent of a teenager? Have you ever been married? That'll test you. That's more than you can handle. Have you ever immigrated to another country? I talked about that. That's huge. Those of you who have jobs, have you ever walked into a job and after 1 hour you realize that it is much more than you have the expertise or knowledge for? Have you ever had financial trouble and not been able to pay the bills and the creditors are calling you every day and you've turned your phone on silent because you know that you do not have the money to pay back these creditors? Have you ever been in a stage of your life and realized that everything you've done amounts to completely nothing because you're faced with a mountain that you cannot overcome? Have you ever been there? Now, do you know what happens when we reach these moments? We launch into the, oh, God cannot give you more than you can handle mode. And instead of trusting God's power in us, we try to work things out on our own. We think that we're strong enough, that we're smart enough, that we're resourceful enough, that we have all we need to work it out. And so that's what we turn to. We turn to ourselves. You know, it's like being in a huge battleship. You know, these military battleships that don't even run on gas. They run on nuclear power. It's like being in one of those, and instead of turning the engine on, you take out your oars and you try to paddle this battleship across the ocean. Now, while you're doing that and you're sweating and you're huffing and puffing, it looks like you're doing something serious. But in the end, you're getting nowhere. You're not moving the battleship. And in moments like these, we have to let go of our pride. We have to let go of our erroneous understanding of God and just turn the engine on. Sometimes we have to let go of ourselves and admit that we are in a situation that is much more than we can handle. Sometimes we have to break down and realize that we're not smart enough to figure our way out. Sometimes we have to admit that we're not strong enough to muscle our way out. And as a guy, as the man in the house, in my house, as the one who my family looks to for strength, that's a tough one for me because I'm supposed to be the strongest and the fastest one in the house. But there are times even I don't have the strength to rescue my family. Sometimes we have to admit that we are weak because when we acknowledge our inadequacies, our failings, and yes, even our weaknesses, and turn to God, that's when we see his true power. Until God is all you have, you will never realize that he's all you need. Until God is all you have, you will never realize that he's all you need. The Apostle Paul, he admits in one of his letters that he had a pretty serious physical ailment. He called it a thorn in his side, a messenger of Satan. How bad does your sickness, does your physical ailment have to be in order for you to call it a messenger from Satan? It has to be pretty bad, eh? And so in the second letter in the church of Corinth, he talks about how he earnestly prayed 3 times for God to remove it. Now, this is not just on Monday he prayed for 2 minutes, then on Tuesday he prayed for 2 minutes, then on Wednesday he prayed for 2 minutes. No. This was like fasting and laying on of hands and crying out to God in anguish for weeks, maybe months. But in those moments of dealing with something in his physical being that was so much more than he could handle, he came to a new understanding of how God works. And he wrote it in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul turns a corner and he says something very surprising. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest in me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. That's the weirdest thing anyone has said. I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. This is a man that had come to realize that God He will allow us to walk through situations that are more than we can handle. But in the middle of those gut-wrenching situations, we find something awesome and upside down. We find that Christ's power comes to rest in us when we are weak. We find that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Until you realize that God is all you have, you'll never realize that God is all you need. And when we realize this, we no longer have to be afraid of the things we cannot handle, because when we walk through these times, it's clearly an opportunity to turn to God and say, you're a big guy. I'm just going to stand back and watch you work. God will never give you more than you can handle. God did not say that. God never said that. But what he has promised is that if you turn to him, when we're well beyond what you can handle, you'll experience his presence and you'll experience his power. But I think that the real lesson here that we need to learn is that you don't have to wait until things are so bad that you don't know what to do before you have to call on God. I think that the lesson here is to not wait until you're being snowed under by the circumstances that are beyond your control. I think that the lesson here is to learn to depend on God when you're on the mountain before you get to the valley. Because if you learn to depend on him when things are going well, you won't have to worry about a thing when you inevitably face the trials that life throws at us. God doesn't want to be your helpline only when things are going badly. He wants to be our helper even when things are going well. And when we give up the show of strength and start to depend on his strength, when we give up trying to be the smartest and lean into his wisdom, when we boast in our weaknesses, like Paul says, we find that God is all we need, not just in the bad times, but in the good times. You can be sure that God will allow you to go through more than you can handle. But the awesome thing is that if you turn to him, you don't have to walk through it on your own. He'll carry you right through it if you let him. Psalm 23, turn that sheet of paper over. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, They comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.